Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Hold My Drink, where we navigate the news and politics with a chaser of civility. I'm your host, Jen, inviting you to grab your favorite beverage, sit back, and imagine with us how to create a new American identity together. Welcome to this week's Hold My Drink and Counterweight podcast with my co-host, David Bernstein. Today, we have Jason Miller with us. He is the host of the YouTube show, Native Liberty. And before we get started, Jason, did you bring a drink to this table to the table today?
Yeah, just one of my favorite Coors Light. It's not really just a domestic beer, so
Shame on you.
yeah.
David, what about you?
We bought lemonade and vodka
Nice.
for a
Nice.
change. Yeah.
So I'm doing a hot toddy. And it's so funny because here in Texas, when it drops down to like 90, you're like, oh, I feel a little chill. We can like get something hot. So that's, yeah, I think that it's cold and I've got a hot toddy. So that's me today. Uh, so Jason, I have to tell you, I have been, you don't know this, but you've been on runs with me this whole week. I
Uh-huh.
carry you around and I listen to you on my runs.
Oh,
And I have
wow.
to frequently stop because I'm just like, I feel like listening to you is like reading or talking to Helen Pluckrose. I'm like,
Oh, I'm not. No,
mind
she's at another level. I'm like,
blown.
yeah.
Well, I don't know what it is, but I'll tell you, you bring it down. And even that, I think that for me, I might need you to even bring it down lower, but you bring it to a place where you're like, oh, holy crap. Like, wow, that's what that is, And I
Uh,
think that's what Helen does in Cynical Theories. And so I've just been you've blown my mind this whole week while I'm running. Sometimes I have to stop and pause and rewind. But I've got two like intro questions for you. And my first is, when did you notice all the crazy going on? I mean, you have just done so much. I know from what I've heard about you, you've been doing research on critical race theory, critical theory, whatnot for years. But when did you notice and go, oh boy, this
um,
is
yeah. So for me, it's weird because I had seen it in the culture. What happened at Harvard over the Halloween thing. I think back in 2016. Then the explosion of Jordan Peterson and how he got like trapped on campus. I saw all this stuff and I thought, okay, these are just your typical Berkeley one-offs, these schools, and these are just, child adolescent teenagers just going off without any, the romanticism of revolution. And I didn't think much of it. And then it kind of coalesced with the death of George Floyd. And then I started getting I have friends with both native and non-native people where I work at. I've worked there for over 24 years, and people were coming to me and saying, I had a real good friend who told me that both of his daughters, who were like I think at the time 21 and 19, they stopped talking to him because he wouldn't agree with their philosophical position of this critical race theory stuff, and it was affecting him and his family. Then I had my native friends coming to me, and within my own family, asking me like, what is this, what's going on? I can't communicate with my son or daughter. And that was my first initial reaction with it. I was like, this may be something a lot deeper than I realized. I thought it was just a one-off here and there, and a random anomaly. And then I started realizing, no, there's a lot more going on. So that's kind of the impetus for me creating my channel, was really just to create a small channel just to get it for my friends and associates and colleagues at work, and family members. And then I didn't expect, James Lindsay, to catch that one podcast episode. Then I guess he tweeted it out. I went from like, I think maybe 42 subscribers for like 3 or 4 months, which is fine. I wasn't looking for anything beyond that. And then all of a sudden, I think it's now at almost 1,200, which is, it's still relatively small. And I haven't published anything like in 3 months now. So, but that's kind of the catalyst for me getting involved. And I'm going to actually start getting back into producing more videos here real soon. Now that I'm laid off from work because of the vaccine mandate. So, but
ooh,
I still be getting back into it here. I have more time to devote to that. So,
we're gonna have to talk about that. But I will before we do, I'm writing that down. Is you are so knowledgeable. So, like, did you study this? Are you just an avid reader? I mean, you really, like I said, you are at this. When I listen to you, I hear this level of understanding that I hear from like a Helen Pluckrose, but you're able to bring it down. Like, how?
yeah, this is something that Well, I'm also a Christian. So for years prior, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, I studied postmodernism. I had read a bunch of books about postmodernism infiltrating the church. And I wanted to, I believe in like that old Renaissance saying ad fontes, go back to the sources. So I went back to, I read Derrida, Foucault, Lyotard, Baudrillard. I started getting into the actual sources themselves. And then from there, I went off like into apologetics, defending the faith. And those
Mhm.
all kind of tied in with 15 years later with what we're seeing now. I just had to kind of like refocus and a lot of stuff that I was telling someone else, like, I never thought I would have to be engaging this stuff that I learned 15, 20 years ago and having to like dust off the cobwebs in my mind and be like, okay, there's some connections here, but I couldn't really get, and it really wasn't until uh, the grievance studies papers came out with Lindsay, Bogosian, and Pluckrose that I saw the connection. It was their work and they're on the front lines where I was like, oh, I know this stuff. I've read this stuff before. Like you came back to me and I just had to dust off my books on the other side of this book room to kind of get back into, oh, this is exactly what we're experiencing. This is not an anomaly. There's this real cultural force here that's taking place. And then I had to go back and get my old Gramsci books out and the prison notebook papers. I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't think this was. I thought this was a dead issue. Like we learned that the Soviet Union failed and communism and socialism and private property works and the free market works, and I didn't realize this is back on us again, but it's taking a new form. This critical race theory stuff. Yeah, like I remember reading the Frankfurt School 15, 20 years ago, Marcuse, Horkheimer, um, and some of the other authors, and I think, okay, this is something that happened in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and it's done with, and here it is again, like what this repeating itself again.
Are there certain trends in the ideology that we're talking about, whatever we call it? It's so hard to figure out what the right term is. I mean, we call it a lot of times critical social justice because it's more of an umbrella term, wokeness, whatever. Are there certain concepts or reasons why you feel that are inherent to the ideology itself that you feel that it's pernicious, that it's causing all this problems in schools and other institutions?
Yeah, definitely. I see it as a resurgence. I mean, I know other people talked about this, everybody from Jordan Peterson to Lindsay, but it's I don't agree with the victimhood nature of it. I don't think that the way forward. I think for a certain slice in time, I'm a proponent of classical liberalism, where I'm very libertarian, but I hold, I guess you could say classical liberalism, and I believe that actually worked. A colorblind society is what we need to go. We're actually regressing from, and this notion that everything should be focused on race, and that becomes a central foci of your life, your identity of your race. I think that's actually a step backwards, and we're gonna, instead of actually solving racial issues, and there's real issues, I believe, real issues of injustice, within the United States Supreme Court, certain cases, regulatory law, and this is actually a distraction from that, and we're not going to get. And I think the term like equity, and just the fact that the language itself is based upon the postmodern conception of problematizing, that this is an
Yes.
ongoing, never-ending process. There's never going to be any point in time where critical race theorists or social justice warriors, whatever you want to call it, are going to say, okay, now we're finally equitable. Now we're finally equal. We can finally stop this. No, there's never going to be a point in time. It's going to be constantly. Once you hand over the reins to that, you'll never get it back.
Right.
I
Right.
view this as. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
It's an act of deferring,
Yes.
and it's the gift that keeps on giving.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. The curse that keeps on cursing. Yeah.
Yes.
What
Yeah.
what part of it do you think is the most damaging to Native American psychology? I mean, that's, you started out talking about that, and then you really dived into critical theory in more in general, but something must have like triggered something where you felt that this was very pernicious,
Mhm.
in particular to indigenous populations.
Well, it started with friends of mine who I've known for over 20 years, and family members, and even within my own immediate family with my daughter. She was espousing certain ideas, and I just like, wait, hold on here. That like I can't believe you said that. You know me as your father. You know my belief system. Like, why would you say that? Why would you focus on race as an issue? And I started hearing words like oppression and domination, uh, and that. structural racism, and then I kept hearing it from some of my friends from their kids were saying the same thing. And I thought, okay, I guess my focus was that if we're not careful, we're going to lose that younger generation of Native American kids. They're going to see this as not as a cultural phenomenon or something to be studied, but as like the gospel truth. They're just going to absorb and digest this particular outlook, which I view
Mhm.
as very toxic in itself. And that's to me is where I got started getting involved in this. It was really to hone in and hopefully have like the parents become aware of what's going on, as well as hopefully the kids, their children would see. Because I really think this is, if it's allowed to fester and grow, this could be very well the end of civilization. Yeah, I just don't see it
Mhm.
as, this is not a boon. We're like I said before, we're regressing backwards. And I feel like I had talked to, I think actually her name is Dawn. She was on one of my podcasts, and she had mentioned how the prevalence of TikTok videos, and that her own daughters were seeing constantly these videos. They were, it's like 15-second, 30-second videos, and it was about some non-native person decrying their white privilege. And you get enough of that culturally through osmosis, just every day, seeing these images and hearing people. You don't really investigate it. You just, oh, this is must be, this must be the truth. This must be what's out there, and it just kind of permeates the culture that way. And I'm so afraid that younger native people will view this as a form of an impetus for revolution or social change. It's like, no, we actually had that in place. We actually had this thing called classical liberalism. It wasn't a perfect panacea, but it was the best we had because we're all equal on the same playing field. Yes, there was great social injustice in the past, and I'm not denying that. I have a bunch of books behind me that talk about that. I'm not arguing against that, but the way forward is to spread classical liberalism. Not to actually go backwards in time and to constantly look through this very colonial, postmodern view of culture that's constantly tearing the fabric of society to pieces apart. So that's kind of where I get. Oh, sorry.
Okay, I want to ask you. So one of the things that I've been obviously, like you have, I'm sure, and following the critical race theory discussion in schools, and there's a group of people that said CRT, denies history, or and then there are others that are just sort of denying that CRT is taught at all. And then what they'll tend to do is say that it's yes, CRT is not taught. However, we do believe that we should teach our kids how structural racism affects society. That's what you'll hear a lot of times. And it seems to me that that's what we mean when we say CRT is in the classroom, and that's what they mean when they say we should teach about racism in the classroom. And then the question I have is, well, A, do you agree with that? And B, do you believe that? What do you think we should tell our kids, if anything, about systemic racism?
Yeah, see, that's the thing. As coming from, I can't deny, I'm both races. I'm half native and half non-native. I'm Hopi, Miwok, and German Scottish. So I can't ever deny either side of who my identity, who I am. And so I don't like it when I remember going to school and I had a very sanitized version of American history taught to me. And I remember thinking, this doesn't jive with what I know, from my grandparents, my great grandparents, my mother, what they've experienced on the reservation, and
Mhm.
the trials that they've gone through, and and as I got older, the history of certain Supreme Court cases that have almost embedded like racial assumptions, in the language itself, like the relationship of the Native American to the government is a dependent to a guardian award relationship. The whole Marshall trilogy and Supreme Court law defines Native Americans that they can have rights of occupancy but not ownership of the land. There's all this, and you look at throughout the history. There's that's what I was saying earlier. There's actual real injustice that we need to figure out as a society. But focusing on this I view it as a hasty generalization. This term, white supremacy, um, this view that there's structural racism. I don't see it, and I guess what I don't like is the extreme position of teaching this very sanitized, clean version of American history. This like almost American exceptionalism without talking about all the warts and everything that also happened, all the horrible injustices. Neither do I like the I'm going to say this, but like the Howard Zinn Chomsky version of the other extreme, where it's everything's negative, it's horrible. We've nothing America. It's like I view that also as a form of what's called the Nirvana fallacy, where you judge a society or a country by this perfect utopian standard, but yet you don't judge that society itself that you're judging
Right.
from with that same standard. And so I don't want either one of those extremes. I always believe there's a nice happy medium where you inform students in the classroom, yeah, this is what's happened in history. And we did intern Japanese. We did treat Native Americans bad. There's the Trail of Tears. There's all these horrible injustices. There's a Dawes Act, the Allotment Act. There's the assimilation era, the Indian removal. I mean, there's all these horrible instances in American history. But if you also look at the big scale of history in every other country, and then if you actually apply that to Native Americans themselves, tribes didn't treat each other as some sort of benign people. They were always at war with each other.
Right.
I mean, there was peaceful tribes. I'm not saying again, it's not monolithic, but the point of is that within history, especially within tribal structures, there's a great heterogeneity amongst tribes. Each one has a different customs, cultures, belief systems. Some had private property. They may not have had it in a formal sense, but it was there in an informal sense. And so what I see also I've come across is that you'll get this almost Marxian adoption uh, of natives who say that because we never owned the land and private property, we owned it in common. Therefore, we should adopt some sort of Marxist socialist system. I think no, you haven't done your homework. Go look at some of the East Coast tribes or West Coast tribes, or even my tribe. There's matriarchal, patriarchal lineage. There's divisions within the land, rotating crops amongst families, fishing rights. There's all this informal system in place or institutions. And I see that again with this whole notion of, I guess I'm going off on a tangent here, but I'm saying that when it comes to history, I think it should teach a realistic understanding of history and not this jaundiced version or nor this extreme version from either sides. I guess my long way of saying this.
Sure. I want to stick with systemic racism, and this may be a little selfish, as Jennifer knows. I'm fascinated by the topic. At some point, I'm going to write an article for Free Black Thought on sort of an exploration of systemic racism, and I see it used in two separate ways.
Hmm.
One is it's used in the way that you talked about, like America's a white supremacist society. In other words, America is systemically racist. Another way you could look at it is, are there particular institutions where bias is embedded? In other words, is there still systemic racism in America, even if America is not systemically racist? What do you
Hmm.
think about that question?
It's a good question. I think that gets a little bit further to where I'm like politically located is that there is within Supreme Court cases. That's where my focus is on, that affects Native Americans to this day that are, like you said, embedded racism. There's racial assumptions embedded within it. But that doesn't mean that all of society is inherently racist. That doesn't mean there's this thing called white supremacy that's structural throughout society. I don't hold to that theory. I think it's actually very shallow kind of thinking. I think this again probably is my worldview. Is I do believe in individualism or individuality. I believe also in the group. I don't like the either or approach. I think there's both the individual. We're not born into this world de novo. We're born into a family, so there's a structure in place. Um, but I think like going back to the Marshall trilogy, there's the Johnson v. McIntosh, which is the first decision that Chief Justice John Marshall instituted. And the holding was basically that Native Americans, they have the right to occupancy, but not the right of ownership on their land, which means you've taken away their ability to transfer property, to privatize property, to use that property in a way to pull together for resources, to become part of society. So you've got an institution that's completely backwards. So like where I work at here, or where I did work at here, you've got the Pima tribe, and you've got these other tribes. You got my tribe, the Hopi tribe, the Navajo tribe, and it's like you can see the difference as soon as you just cross over from one territory to the next. From the city, you see wealth and affluence, progress, and then you go over to the reservation, and it's completely the opposite. It's like third world poverty, and it's not because of anything to do with the mind or cognitive faculties or the color of one's skin or any cultural factors. It's because I believe, as studying economics, that it's an institutional reason. And those institutions that are there in place are because of these Supreme Court cases that are still inherently racist, if that makes sense. But I don't see it as a, a white supremacy structural problem. I view it as specific cases that, if they're overturned, that could go a long way in alleviating some of these issues.
And you're seeing it from a legal standpoint. If you took a Flint, Michigan, for example, where there was some serious problems in the water supply, there was a commission that was put in place by the Civil Rights Commission of Michigan, looked at it and ruled that it was an example of systemic racism. That there was a whole series of things from redlining and the like that are systemically racist. I don't know if any of those really involve the nature of the law.
Mm,
And it may be that the law with Native Americans is more likely, because it's so different than the rest of our jurisprudence in many ways, is
mhm.
more likely to have some embedded vestiges of racism than you might see in the in common law. But it's interesting. Yeah, go ahead, Jennifer. Want me to keep?
Yeah, if you were still had other questions, my questions are a little bit more banal.
I know I get into the very esoteric. I get into esoteric questions now, I'm latching on to Jason here because he uses, I'm obviously critical race theory and
Mhm.
wokeness and the rest, but I also am looking for sort of middle ground, if you will, truth in between, as Jennifer would say, because I do believe that there sometimes are insights that we should look at. There are
Definitely.
systems levels analysis that we have that critical theory helps us think about, and so I like it when people like you are able to sort of go there and not dismiss
It
altogether every argument that
yeah, it's
an adversary makes.
I think the hardest part is that as I've gotten older, I realize like, man, thinking is so hard. It's so easy to it's so easy to adopt a binary, I know that's such an overused word, but again, there's
Right.
like you said earlier, there is points in time where it's
Mhm.
actually a legitimate thing. Like, for instance, I'm gonna probably shock people, but I actually I hold to some of the theories that um, Hamni Bobby teaches, which is hybridity. I don't know if you've ever come across that concept,
Mm-mm. Can
but
you explain a little bit?
yeah, yeah. So, and this concept of hybridity is Bobby's concept, and I know people are gonna be like, I can't believe he's quoting this guy. People that follow me, but he's arguing. First of all, he's actually has in mind he's critiquing Edward Said's notion of Orientalism, of this colonialism, and he's arguing that this notion of either or, of it's this colonial power and the colonized, uh, of the oppressor and oppressed class, is these you have it's too neat and tidy. Reality is not that neat and tidy.
Yes,
There's not this
absolutely.
fine line, he's arguing, and that within the blending of the colonizer and the colonized colonialism, there's this liminal space, this hybrid space where
Mm,
it could be hybrid, someone that's hybrid like me, of mixed races, or it could be the culture itself, and that there's this constant overlap between the two, and that's where cultural production, he argues, takes place, and that's the hard road that's always has to be taken. And he argues that's how I look at it. Like, he's actually dealing with, now I know there's some criticism against that, and some people argue against it, but I view that as him grappling with this very oversimplified binary application of this colonial academic, um, heuristic device or schemata or scheme that's being applied through theory to culture. And he's saying it's not that simple. It's not this clear cut path. There's a lot of time there's overlap. And I think, and I look at that and I kind of take from what he's teaching in his books, and I kind of apply that to this notion of white supremacy or structural racism. Like,
it's the
there's,
same thing.
yeah, it's
It's the
like,
same ideology. I mean, it's a post-colonialist ideology that's applied to powerful nations versus powerless nations. You're really taking the same ideology and
exactly.
applying it domestically, right?
Yes. Yep.
So I'm curious about you for a second. So I grew up. I'm Jewish. That's not probably such a shock. And I grew up debating people all the time. And that's what
Uh-huh.
we did. That's what we do. Not every Jewish family is like that, but a lot are. And I was certainly not an exception. And in fact, if anything, probably more on the extreme end. And when my kids, when my kids are over there, we're debating at the Friday night dinner table.
Uh-huh.
And in some ways, it's how I learn, for better or worse, and it has its downsides as well. How did you become yourself? How does a guy growing up and with your background become so enchanted with ideas the way you have? What about your upbringing got you here, or about your personal journey got you here?
Gosh, I don't. That could be a whole. It's a whole show in itself. Well, I think it was the fact that my family is just a huge on my native side is just a big family of breeds. I've got cousins who are Hopi Miwok and Irish, Hopi Miwok German, Hopi Miwok. I've got cousins that are full-blooded Hopi, or Hopi Seminole, Hopi Miwok, and Kiowa. It's just a big melting pot in my family. So we were always taught from, as far back as I can remember, that my grandparents, my parents, to it was almost like just by default that you accepted everyone. We never judged anybody because how could you? I'm a breed child. I'm half. So my grandparents never looked at me as like a lesser of a human being or non-native. They looked at me as the grandson. Same with my parents. Same with all my cousins and my family. So I always grew up in that kind of awareness. But for me, it probably hit like when I was probably like 24, 25 after I had my daughter. I started realizing I'm just going to get back into reading books again. That's honestly, there was no like no gotcha moment for me. It was just I needed to get back and study and stuff. And I think that coalesced at the same time of my wanting to get back into church, wanting to get back to Christianity. And then I actually studied for many years theology and trying to figure out because I was of the point of view that I was a big believer in the theory of evolution and all these different theories. And I thought, okay, if there is a God, if there's not a God, I want to know it, and I'm going to refute it if there is. That's kind of like why I took that position. And so years of studying and studying, and that led, of course, to study history and then political philosophy, and then, of course, into postmodernism, the Frankfurt School, on and on, critical theory. So that's kind of my progression. It's not there's no like epiphany moment, that moment that I had. So yeah, and that's ever since then. I've just always I there's no better feeling in the world when you tackle something that you're not familiar with, and you have that like light bulb moment, and you see the connections. Like, oh man, I get it. And then also, I had gone to college for many years. I'd gone for 3 years, and I was going to go and get my PhD in either economics, history, or philosophy. But I saw the writing on the wall back then. I was like, I'm not going to be able to teach what I want to teach or do what I want to do. So I actually wanted to be a teacher. So yeah, that's a very long-winded answer.
No,
I wasn't
no,
ready
it's
for that
awesome.
question.
About you?
Yeah.
Well, going on that question, so I know that, for you, one of the biggest problems with this imposition of critical theory is the diminishing of the individual.
Mhm.
And I think that's one of my biggest problems too. You mentioned that, religion is important to you. Do you think that the individual and religion kind of go together? Do you think that I feel like a lot of people who have religion, and I
Mhm.
mean, the Judeo-Christian, Islam religion, that like there's this sense of individualism baked in. And so sometimes there's more of a push against this imposition. Do you see that, or do you see, I mean, am I making a connection there?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I think within Christianity, there's both. I mean, going off what the Apostle Paul teaches, there's both individuality. There's different parts of the body, but they also come together to make the one body, the body of Christ, so the bride of Christ, the church itself. So I definitely see that based upon the. I think that's kind of one of the. I mean, that's debatable. Some people argue with me that's not, but I would say that the the birth of um, the enlightenment also came out of as a reaction of course against the superstition of the church, but there was also that Judeo, I think, bedrock principles of individuality or individualism, as well as I think other certain tenets within Christianity that helped launch the enlightenment and helped launch the what we have today, this American system of thought, this American ethos, I think, is also definitely dependent upon that Greek, Roman, Judeo-Christian foundation that I see that's slowly being eroded and pushed aside. So
One, what's interesting, and staying on the theme of religion is, and you do a good job of kind of laying this out, but this new ideology is almost a new religion in a sense. I mean, the
yes,
way, I mean, do you want to see explain that a little bit?
yeah, that's something that it's almost as I was reading some of the core tenets of like Robin DiAngelo and Kendi, and then the intersectionality and some of the writings of Kimberly Crenshaw, and can't think of the other ladies. There's I just read it's over there on my, I forget the name, but the she talks about epistemic pushback. I can't think of her name right now. Allison something. Anyways, but as I'm reading this stuff, it's like it, coming from my background of the Reformed position, the Reformed faith within Christianity, and knowing theology, I'm like, I can see their anthropology here. Their particular understanding of human nature, their eschatology, their end time view, this kind of paradise view that once we, become anti-racist and abolish structural racism, and this utopia will be ushered in. This very millennialistic apocalyptic language. There's also this soteriology, this salvation sense within the writings of the critical race theorists. There's this notion of, like in Christianity, of original sin, but within critical race theory, it's basically white privilege, or being born with white, or white supremacy, white complicity, white fragility. So there's the parallels are shocking. And I remember years ago I studied Marx, and I can't think of the book now, but I want to say "Fire in the Minds of Men" is the name of the book. But he really tweaks out some of the parallels that Marx basically just adopted. As much as he said he didn't like Christianity, he pretty much just adopted the theological tenets, the prolegomena, if you will, of theology, and just kind of rebaptize them and repackage them in this very secular Marxian outlook. And it was almost the same thing. He had the fall in biblical sense was when Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit. According to Marx and even Rousseau, the fall of mankind is when someone invented property. And then you see that kind of tweaked out again in critical race theory, the Frankfurt School, critical theory itself. So there's all these parallels. And I remember seeing a video with James Lindsay, and Helen Pluckrose, and I can't remember the title of the video. It was on YouTube, and they were talking about how the woke itself, how that came about. Like, woke is very similar to being born again within Christian circles. I was like, as soon as he said that, I was like, the connection was like, very palatable, like palatable. Like, I get that now. I see that they almost have their own. And of course, how they treat someone who denies their position. They can't have anybody that's considered a heretic. They're outside the faith. You're canceled. So the parallels are very strikingly, and I haven't done any like in-depth study on it. I just read these things as I come across them, but it's like it's there. I mean, I can see it, and I think it's the hardest part is, as I think, and people will disagree with me, but I think people that have a very secular outlook tend to think that they also are not religious. I view human beings as homo religioso by nature. That is, we're by birth religious, and we can't shake that no matter no matter how much we try. And we're just going to reinvent somehow religion again. And I think that's what this is for many people who don't have some overarching meta narrative, some overarching religious structure. I think for the woke, I think also we're in a period in time where this is, like Peterson said, a crisis of meaning within the culture. And so people are gravitating for something that validates their life. And I understand, as a human being, I know what that's like. I want my life to count. Everybody does. I don't want to go through life with a void. And so that's a very human need. And I think this belief system validates that need, and gives them real feedback on it in real time. I'm on the side of justice, for the side of righteousness, fighting against this evil empire, this evil white supremacy. And I think that gives them immediate feeling of gratification. So I think there's a lot there, psychologically speaking, sociologically speaking as well. Yeah. I'm sorry, that's like a long-winded
This
rant.
is about, are you kidding? We're here to pick your brain.
Okay.
But I think David, your turn.
I completely agree that it is strikingly similar to Christianity, and that's probably by design in a way. My first exposure to the term woke was probably in 2016. I went to a meeting with Black Lives Matter activists. I was the head of a progressive Jewish organization, and we were there to meet and encounter Black Lives Matter activists for the first time. I sort of knew the term woke, but I didn't exactly know what it meant. And then there was a circle of some of the activists came together. They held hands, and they did what I could only describe like a Christian revival. and someone said, I was asleep and now I am woke, and there was a
Oh
lot of
wow.
amens, and I realized like this was really the Christian vernacular
Yeah.
here,
Uh-huh.
playing out in a obviously in a very different setting with a very different theological foundation, but it was drawing on the familiar tropes
Yep.
of Christianity that many of these people had obviously brought up with, but now needed to reinterpret it in a way that described their current condition, or as they saw it.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Yeah.
so I think that's it's fascinating. I think there's a lot of terms. Also, it's just the very idea that you can't question the faith. I mean,
Yeah.
is it's the only problem, and I've told this to some of my more religious friends who agree with me on the critique of wokeness, is that whereas Christianity and Judaism have calibrated themselves for many, many decades to living with and in um, enlightened societies and Western societies, and they have their place in the society. Wokeness that has no such track record,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
and in a way, that's why Wesley Yang called it the successor ideology. In a way, it's meant to actually replace. It's replacement theory.
Yeah.
Replace the liberal values that undergird our society. I know I just went on a rant myself, which
No,
I shouldn't
no,
do.
but I think it's like, after the Reformation, we had the religious wars for like some 30, 40 years, right? And then there was the Peace of Westphalia, which is where it kind of like we hammered out this kind of liberal society.
Yes,
And I feel like
yes,
we're back in it again, with this woke social
right.
justice movement. Like they themselves are trying to, I think, take over, and where there's pushback, of course, and we're in this same like cold war now, with this woke
Right.
movement. And I really do believe that the price of civilization is teetering on the edge right now. So for me, it's like I better get involved and start,
Yeah.
so, and again, I know I've been silent for about 3 months now, not published anything, but it's like I need to get back into getting some more
You,
videos out there about this
yeah,
stuff.
you do. You do. And speaking of which, I'm going to move to, I wouldn't call it banal. It's not really banal, but um, I want to talk about your ideas on the vaccine because I'm tying this into where you just said you think something larger, larger civilization is in jeopardy.
Mhm.
So let's bring it down to an issue that's going on today. What do you think? I know I've seen your ideas on the vaccine mandates. Clearly, you've alluded to the fact that you are no longer employed.
Yeah.
Um, can you give us a little history, your own story around that, and then your feelings around that, and where it fits into that larger picture of a civilization in jeopardy?
Yeah. So sure. Um, so where I work at, I've been there for 24 years. It's on the reservation. I worked for the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community, and I had been there for a very long time. And it was kind of a shock to me about 2 months ago that they said they're going to start instituting mandatory vaccination policy, and there was immediate pushback against it. And I was one of the ones who was saying I'm against this. But this is where, again, I do value freedom, and I know this may come across to certain people as not being true to my principles, but I actually do believe in tribal autonomy, tribal sovereignty. I want tribes to be able to affirm and adopt policies that they believe in. Whether and this is the thing, they adopted a policy that I disagree with, but I also have, and that's their freedom. That's also my freedom to disagree with that policy and my freedom to avoid my contract with the tribe, which is what I did. I don't agree with the tribal's policy of mandatory vaccination, which is what they have in place now. But I also believe, and it's almost, and I don't know if this is an apocryphal saying, but like what Voltaire said, I may not agree with what you're saying, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. So and this is almost like a very slippery slope, gray area for me because I've heard people say, but if you keep taking away people's access to certain things and then defending that by saying, well, that's freedom. But at one point, are you going to realize you have no access to anything? What if grocery stores start adopting this policy, and now I can't go to a grocery store? And this is the thing I tell people that I am probably more vaxxed than most people because when I was a little boy, we lived in Iran, Italy, Germany, and Spain, and then we came back to the States. Every country I went to was like like probably 5 to 8 to 10 shots. Then coming back to the States, so I'm multiply vaxxed. I'm not against it. I'm just extremely hesitant after studying public choice theory, economics, knowing the history of the failures of the government without this feedback loop that's essential in the free market, government, not only when it makes a mistake, it doubles down on that mistake. And so I'm hesitant about the vaccine. That's all. I don't know if I'll ever get it, but for what I can see for right now, what I'm studying that's coming out of Israel, is that the efficacy of the vaccine is very limited. I don't want to go into that territory because I don't want to get your channel, a check mark or something. But
That's okay. We're but yeah, go on.
no, so for me, it's an issue of freedom, and I don't ever want the government dictating to tribes or individual human beings uh, violating their freedom. I'm always going to be a proponent of freedom, but again, that's this weird gray area where I haven't quite. I'm still trying to figure it out. Like I said, what if I wake up tomorrow and all the grocery stores where I live at and say that I can't enter the grocery store unless I show my proof of vaccination? Like, at one point, do I realize that this is no longer working for me? This is not, there's a disconnect. I'm not sure how I can quite weave my way through that. And that's kind of what I've been doing right now, is kind of researching and looking this like throughout history, trying to find examples and trying to understand like what if everybody in society is saying this and I'm the one? Maybe there's something wrong with how I'm viewing the world. I don't know. So I don't have a really good answer for that. At the end of the day, I do support freedom. So
Yeah,
if that makes sense,
of course it does.
position.
I mean, I think that the argument that I hear people say is, well, it's like public safety, right? So like it's like a seatbelt.
Mm.
It's not necessarily for you, it's for the public. What would you say for something like that?
Well, first of all, I hate wearing seatbelts. I can't, like I'm the old school. Like I remember going
Oh
cross
my, we
country without seatbelts.
no. And we
Yeah,
were like playing in the back seat, like tumbling around.
yeah.
Yeah, no.
So I remember going to the PX Navy base with my father and my mom, and she would go shopping, and he would drink a beer on the back of the truck, and there'd be other guys. And it wasn't. This is, I mean, of course, we don't want that nowadays. But I was like, this is a different. I grew up in a different time frame.
Right.
I remember going to sleep, and the screen door was unlocked. There was no locks on the door. I mean, there was locks on doors, but we never locked the doors. It was just a different time. So for me, it's hard to adopt this very therapeutic, safety-centered society that we
Yeah.
have now. It's like when I was a kid, I rode bikes and I crashed and flew over the handlebars, and I've got more scars on my body than most people. And then now it's like kids can't go outside with being completely padded and helmeted up. And I'm not saying, hey, that's, and now again, that's their freedom and the parents' freedom to do what they want with their child. But for me, it's just foreign to me. It's hard for me to adopt that this new safety orientated policy or cultural ethos that's our culture has absorbed. And so for me, that's extremely hard to. And I feel like we're going down this road that we can't seem to get out of. We're not going to. I don't know. And so I'm sorry. What was the question?
Well,
I'm
no,
like
well, I was just
rambling.
talking about seatbelts, but you
Oh,
said something about safetyism, and I wanted to touch on that because I wonder though if this like hypersensitivity to safety isn't part of what has made us as a society so pliable
mhm.
to the imposition of some of these views of the critical social justice. I mean, I wonder if those two are somewhat
Crossovers.
related.
Yeah, I would say so. I think there's definitely certain tenets within each. I think it's this. I mean, this notion that again, I keep going back to the Nirvana fallacy, but this notion I've talked to people and I say I work for government. I've had family that work for government. And there's this like mythical notion that somewhere locked in away in a room is a group of public servants trying to solve our problems. Like that's not people don't just magically go to Washington and then just transform and lose apathy and lose their vices. If anything, it becomes worse within a government structure. So I think there's definitely overlap between this view towards changing society from the critical justice point of view, and also this view that if we just trust the science or trust our politicians, trust our government, that it's that same overlap there that's in place. I don't know. I don't have like a thought out answer for that, but I do see the similarities there, and that our culture seems to be gravitating back and forth between those two positions and are kind of coalescing, I should say.
All right, David, before I get to more banal questions,
Uh-huh. You're sending them back to the esoteric.
Yeah, to the esoteric.
Now,
I've got a few closing banal. I'll close
why don't
with
you
that.
go to Banal? We can always
No,
bring Jason back for the philosophical. That's
I think we have time for one more philosophical.
okay. All right. Let me see where I'd like to take it. Um, what do you think can be done? This may not be so philosophical, but what do you think can be done to reverse the tide here? I hear two things run in my mind all the time. On the one hand, if we can organize people and bring out a critical mass of people to come out and say we want liberalism in our society, classical liberalism in our society, we can turn the tide. On another hand, there seems like a whole generation of people, your kids, my kids, have been exposed to this, not only exposed to this, but really inculcated in
Mm.
this, and they're going into the workplace and changing the culture. Where do you come down? Are you an optimist, a pessimist, and what do you think needs to be done to maximize your optimism?
I, I wish I had like I wish I could say I was always optimistic. I seem to fickle. I fluctuate with whatever is on the news that day. I'm like, oh my god, you got to be kidding me! Is this like the one day is like worse than the next day? Is like this? Is this like some absurd dream that I'm dreaming that this is, can't be happening, right? So, but I tend to be optimistic. I think that there is a true underlying American ethos that just is we're so different from the rest of the world. We really there is something here that is I think that is still and even in spite of critical race theory and this critical theory social justice, I think in spite of that, when you go to like middle America, you don't get that same feeling that you do in big cities. Like in San Francisco and Portland and New York, it's very different. There's a almost like I said on one interview, I was like, I'm almost like, is Twitter real? I mean, I'm not arguing its metaphysical ontological properties, but it's like, is that is it a heightened reality? Is it this cross? Or is it a liminal space? Is it a hybrid space? Is it it's virtual, but it's also reality? But it's like at the same time when I'm on Twitter, and I actually view Twitter now as I've been using it as actually a valid. I don't know. I hate to say the word institution, but I think it's going off what Michael Malice said one time in an interview. It's like you're seeing in real time opinions and what's trending, and that you're seeing in real time a data set of you put something out there, or somebody that you follow put something out there, and you're seeing how many people like it and dislike it, and the ratios of that. Now, again, that could be just completely false trend, but I think there's a certain value to that mindset, or not to the mindset, but to Twitter, and so I tend to be optimistic because of my Christian beliefs, and my belief system. But then there's days where it's like, oh my gosh, I can't like this. I gotta tune off for a while. It's like overbearing. Like, what was it that just released 2 days ago that they're gonna send the FBI after domestic terrorists for parents objecting to critical race theory? I'm
Mhm.
like, just did other people not see this as a violation of everything that's our American principles? And then I go and I go I'll purposely go outside of my Twitter sphere and go find people that are on the opposite side of the aisle, and it's like, oh my gosh, these people really exist, and they're just as fervently committed to their position as I am. I'm like, there is a real clashing of worldviews is what I see is happening right now in our culture. It's like we are in that 30-year war right now, this Cold War that's happening. This really is I think what I see too is that Gramsci's hegemonic takeover of the institutions has really happened right under everyone's noses. That people have been. I think the cultural war has happened since the 80s, and conservatives have been screaming about that. And I think most of society has kind of been asleep about that. And I think they're seeing it more and more every day. So to answer the
Yeah.
question, I feel I'm optimistic. Yeah, overall, 80% of the time is very optimistic. Yeah. And I think how you just combat bad ideas with good ideas. I don't believe in censorship. I believe you get enough exposure and enough people out there exposed to truth and good ideas, and why you explain to people why the classical liberal outlook, the Enlightenment, was a good thing. Why these principles are good.
All right, so in ending up, I know you're coming from a Native American heritage or half Hopi. I've got to ask some like things about how in this new critical social justice ideology we've been talking about, you know, our Native American heritage. So, how do you feel about? I'm sorry, this isn't funny, but I've been on meetings where you have to do your land acknowledgments.
Oh no, yeah, cringe.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm trying not to laugh because but here's the thing though, Jason. I mean, I know that it comes from a good place because and we already said there were some horrible things
Hmm.
that happened, you know?
Yes.
I don't think anyone that I know denies that.
Yeah.
But the land acknowledgement things, and then this one that I was on, they started playing it. It was coming out of Australia and they started playing a didgeridoo.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
And again, like the didgeridoo is lovely, but
Yeah.
it was
Yeah.
all performance art.
Exactly. Yeah. That's what it is to
So
me.
yeah, okay.
That to me is actually a good example of Judith Butler's performative act. I mean, I know she's applying that to gender, but it's to me, it's like, what value is that adding? And I look at that as it may be, like you said, it may be, I'll borrow your word, it may be a banal thing, right? It may be looked upon from one point of view as just a, a slight acknowledgement. But what I don't like is that underlying invisible hidden ethos underneath it, that I think that if that spreads is actually horrible for the for our republic, because once you allow that, what's behind it is this notion again, it's that it's not enough to be against racism, you have to be anti-racist, and that's part of that paradigm where it says that you've got to acknowledge that your campus or your organization is on living on stolen land. And right now, that may be at a stage where it seems to be innocuous, but underneath that, I think is what's the dangerous part, because eventually they'll say, if you really want to be for diversity, inclusion, and equity, then you'll relinquish this land. You'll start hiring more native people of color. It's like, I believe in merit. I believe in individuality, individualism. I believe you should earn your position in society. So that runs counter to me, and I just view that as possibly, again, I'll borrow from James Lindsay and those guys, but it's like a Trojan horse. Right now, it seems like something that's insignificant. It's just a land acknowledgement. But I view that as also, from growing up from the native side, many of my cousins, we just look at that as extremely cringy. It's like, I've actually been like, this is a bad example, but I've been to weddings uh, from non-natives, and they mean it as a compliment. They'll dress up in buckskins and with feathers, and the bride, and they'll even play like a flute, as if that's like the only thing that natives play is the flute. And it's like, man, and I know they mean well, and I know they're trying to compliment, but it's like, oh, that's just so like cringy and just not. I don't look at it as offensive, but it's just, to me, that is on the same level of these land acknowledgements. I know they mean well, and maybe some people are doing it because they do mean well, but I look at that again, what's underneath that, what worldview is shaping that. And I think that worldview is antithetical to moving forward towards back to a classical liberal society.
Hmm. Yeah, well, okay. So one other question that touches on that, but okay. So I have to backstory. When I was a young girl, my dad we were part of something called Indian Princesses, which I'm sure doesn't exist anymore because
Uh,
I mean, bad. But I have to tell you, like, I was so proud to be an Indian princess because, like, Indian princesses rocked, I mean, they were tough and they, like, could survive in the wild. And that was the
uh,
whole idea behind Indian princesses. It was like a father daughter thing. And it was like not survivalist, like, as in, like, prepper, but survivalist, like, how, a father teaching a daughter how to change a tire. I mean, like,
yeah.
serious
Hmm.
stuff, right? And we would go out bird watching and stuff. And so anyways, always grew up, and I mean, I was that little kid that did dress up as an Indian, which was now cultural appropriation. I am so glad we don't have, like, we didn't have social media because my life would have been ruined, already. Um, but it was because I loved it so much, and so I mean, like, I was so disappointed when the whole Washington Redskins, the
Oh yeah.
Chiefs, and all
Mhm.
that. To me, that was like they chose those names because they were badass.
Exactly. No,
You know?
I have friends, full-blooded native friends, and all of us. I don't know if it's our age group, because I'm middle-aged and they're pretty much the same age as me. But we love the Washington Redskins. And I'm talking about full-blooded Pima guys, full-blooded Hopi guys, full-blooded Seminole people, Kiowa, Apaches, some Sioux guys that I know that was our team. I mean, I was born in DC, so I was always been a Redskin fan, and I was like, also like, what Washington football team? That's so lame, you know. But again, that's the disconnect. That's kind of what I was pointing earlier to. I think your question, David, that the younger generation, they were the kind of the spearheading that movement. That they had bought into that critical race theory, and that this was a sign of cultural appropriation, of oppression, committing violence. I was like, how is the name committing violence? I don't get that. But I mean, I do within the theory, but that again, to me, it was all being pushed by that younger generation. And that's where I kind of like got involved, because I wanted to target that younger generation and kind of like give the parents and give that audience like some counter information that they had been learning in school. Because most of the contact that I do, if I do have contact with the younger generation and the 20-year-olds, it's very rare just because of generational gap. But we were completely on we're on like polar opposites of each other as far as being native. Their identity is almost a rejection of what they would view as a dominant culture. Where mine and my friends who are breeds or full-bloodeds, what we call FBI's, full-blooded Indians, their position is one of like give and take, of absorption, and of like actual just freedom of expression, freedom. Like, I like this team, I don't care what you say. I like this practice, I'll take some of this traditional, I'll take some of this Christianity, I'll do this, I'll believe in this. There's no, I don't know if it's a generational thing, if it's a Gen X thing. I don't know what it is.
I don't actually think that they're rejecting the dominant culture. I think they're embracing the dominant culture. The dominant culture is wokeness. I mean, in some ways, they're pretending like that they're rejecting whiteness or whatever, but what they're really doing is just embracing an alternative version of the dominant culture in some ways. By the way, just to be clear, I was an Indian guide, and my name was White Cloud. I don't know why my name was White Cloud, but so I have a, like, you know, sort of it's like a double there, you know. But it's but yeah, so I also was in the Indian Guides. I mean, that was a big deal. Like, my dad was running bear, and you know, we took it very, very seriously.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds like, you know, it's a joke, and it was not demeaning. At least the way we understood it, was not demeaning at all. We learned a lot of the traditional Boy Scout, you know, skills sets and everything else, and we shot our 22 rifles and everything else. But yeah, so you know, I have mixed feelings about the Redskins. I don't know, maybe it was time. You know, language can change some, right? I mean, but anyway.
Oh my gosh, I'm gonna call you White Cloud.
You really? Okay. Then I'm gonna have to do some, you know, traditional dress here.
Imagine being a breed and having to choose every Halloween in like grade school whether I wanted to be a pilgrim or a native that year. It's like, can I be both?
All right. Oh my gosh. Okay. So we have taken up enough of your time. How do you always end your own podcast? And you have a lead, not follow. How do you? What is the?
It's a Latin phrase. I actually learned that. I saw that I was heavily involved in jiu-jitsu when I was younger. Once I get into my 40s, I had to stop because I was just constantly getting injured all the time, and I wasn't healing fast enough. But there is a flag. It's from Brazil, and it says "Non duco duco," which means I am not led, I lead. And so I use that as my like signature, which I just completely culturally appropriated from the Portuguese population. So,
you know,
but I mean, it's a Latin term, but I mean, it's beyond. It's more than just the one country.
So Jason, wow, thank you so much. It was so good to get to know you, and I hope that this is the first of many many conversations. So what is it again? Lead, not follow, or
non duco duco. I am not led, I lead.
I'm not led, I lead. All right. Well, I appreciate you. Thank you so much, Jason.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hold My Drink. Like or subscribe to the show and check out the show notes for links to source material and to our website, where you can find what each of us is reading every week, different news with different views. If you have a topic that you would like us to explore, drop us a line. And join us next week as we say, hold my drink, and the conversation gets real.